So I just wanted to speak quickly to, I think a lot of the certain guys kind of gravitated towards this approach as a wireless strategy because of some of the security things that we do. But kind of the goal of this presentation is kind of educate a little bit on some of the trends in wireless that we see for security, and most of this will apply to any enterprise vendor you have. So that was the intent of this, and if you want to talk any Aerohive specific things, certainly you can reach out to the certain team, or in the back we've got Mike Fortenberry, who is our regional sales manager for this area, so he's another point of contact, and we'll answer any questions you have. Caught you right after lunch, so if I see anybody nodding off, I've only got 5 bullets to throw here with these bees, but my aim is pretty good. It's gotten that way because people fall asleep in my presentations all the time, so I've gotten a lot of practice. I can wing them right across the room. So if you do have questions or you see something you want to dig into a little bit more, I haven't lost all of my engineering capabilities. I lose a little bit more every day, but hopefully I can answer technical questions you may have, and if not, we'll make sure we get you an answer. That's kind of a long-winded intro, but why don't we go ahead and get rolling here for the sake of time. So this is kind of the reality of things that are happening today, as you guys are probably getting some exposure to this. This is kind of a consumer example of everything being connected and what we generally call the Internet of Things. These are devices that never before really had network access, is becoming much more commonplace. Consumer world, of course, this has kind of been around for a while, but certainly we're seeing this creep up in all the enterprise accounts, and from HVAC systems to freezers to all these things. To get that advanced analytics and maintenance and things like that, they need network connectivity. And this is sort of the world that is happening, and it's certainly providing a challenge on security. I'll get into that in a little more detail. So there's, in the not too distant future, we're talking about a year and a half or so, they're throwing around numbers of 20 billion some odd devices that are going to be connected to the network. Vast majority of those will be Wi-Fi wireless technology that any Wi-Fi vendor would sell. There's a couple reasons for that. Wi-Fi is pretty cheap as far as getting connectivity, card chips and things like that into those devices. There are other wireless technologies out there. You'll hear Halo and Zigbee and BLE. But Wi-Fi tends to be the dominant player here. That's mostly because of the economics. Wi-Fi chipsets are very inexpensive, and when they're building an HVAC system or they're building a freezer and they can see all the different options they have, these are basically some of the options they have for getting those things connected, Wi-Fi still is the dominant player, and that's pointing that out because that's where your implications are for getting those devices securely onto a Wi-Fi network. Is going to impact your entire security strategy over Wi-Fi. So these are the things that are coming. Wi-Fi should still continue to be the dominant player as far as network connectivity, and that's going to, of course, cause you to think about your security strategy and some of those things. This is just an example of a customer in the UK. For Deloitte, they've got all their lighting sensors are all connected over Wi-Fi, 6,000 IP addresses. And they do all the fancy stuff when you pull up into a parking lot, and they know who you are, and they light up everything for you. And they claim the ROI comes from the energy savings, and they can be green and all that kind of stuff. But certainly this is an extreme example, but we hear examples all the time of even a K through 12 school district. We hear examples of the facility spent $4 million on this huge HVAC system that only works if it's connected over Wi-Fi network. And they spent the money, and then they go to IT afterwards and say, by the way, you've got to connect this up at every one of these locations, or that $4 million investment we made is no good. So that tends to be what we hear about the most, and a lot of times you can't necessarily be as proactive as you want to be in the IT world. As you guys probably all know, a lot of the things end up coming to you after decisions have been made by other departments, and it's your job now to get those on the network securely. That's the trend we see, but it's certainly things that are happening right now. And this is kind of a recent poll that just shows if you look at the top 2 reasons, those are tied now, really around quality/performance and security. That's a good thing. If you had the same poll probably 3 or 4 years ago, security would probably be at the bottom tier of that list. People knew about it, but it wasn't certainly what most people cared about. Wi-Fi probably at that time, maybe it was more of a convenience, or it wasn't a primary access layer, or it had some kind of purpose-built guest-only internet, that kind of thing. But as Wi-Fi has become more pervasive, more strategic, more of a critical part of how most business or operations and things like that run, the recognition around security for Wi-Fi has creeped up, and this is a promising sign that hopefully shows when people make a Wi-Fi decision, security certainly is part of that, a critical part of that decision criteria. So when we talk about kind of what are the top 5 sort of things that people see from a security, mistakes that we tend to see out there, kind of list out a few of these, and probably the first one is really just around that kind of network visibility. Almost every enterprise wireless solution today, if you're running and had it for the last 2 or 3 years or so, has some of this visibility and things built in. In the Aerohive world, because we don't have that controller aspect, we centralized all the management into something called Hive Manager. It's just an NMS, a network management server. It can run in the public cloud, which is most common. Some people prefer to run it on premise. You can do that too. But every vendor has this sort of piece. This is kind of that centralized management view that allows you to see things and see who's connecting. And so things we tend to focus on, the most customers come to us and say they want to see are who the user is, where are they, what applications are they running, what time of day. These are things that tend to be the most common criteria when people look at managing and seeing the visibility of these devices. We've got one component that's pretty popular. That top part that's kind of a slide bar, so you can take that back 30 days and replay all this information. That becomes pretty cool for doing like forensics and going back in time to see who was doing what when. But you really need to have this kind of visibility so that you have a better understanding of how people are connecting to the network. What are they doing when they're on it? How long are they staying? Where are they moving to? And that kind of helps you get a little bit of visibility around this potential attack vector and user behavior so that you've got the information you need to either make decisions or make tweaks or tunes to the policy or just know where some of those security threats will be. So this is certainly something you want from any of the vendors out there. You just want to make sure you're getting the kind of visibility that's going to help you do your job and certainly help you have some kind of that network security visibility. And these are generally the things that people want to know. It's the who, what, when, where, what type of device it is, who the user is, how they authenticated, what do they do when they were on, how long did they stay on. And when you have that kind of visibility, you really start to be able to make more intelligent decisions about your security policy and how it's being used. The next big thing we tend to see is a lot of people don't take advantage of something that Wi-Fi makes pretty simple. And this is something called role-based access. This is kind of identity-driven access policies. So based on who I am, I get this certain policy, and that's how I can enforce rules and how I allow somebody on the network to do whatever their job is. Wi-Fi technology actually makes this very simple. This is something that, I'll say relatively simple, but it is kind of built into the framework of any enterprise wireless solution, but we don't always see people take advantage of it the way they should. And this is why you can you come to the folks like the Certain Group. I mean, they can help you make these kind of designs. We get involved in a lot of cases to help people kind of tune things and make sure they're taking advantage of this concept of role-based access. But the reality in a Wi-Fi world particularly is you run into a conference room, you've got 3 different people there, they're probably in 3 different, potentially they're in 3 different roles. Very common. You may have a guest, you may have a contractor, employee. Even if they were all employees, they may be different roles within that employee group. You may have HR, finance, IT, and what you generally would like to do in an ideal world is apply those policies differently. These are different roles. They should not have the same level of access. And when you can tune this up a bit so that you can give those specific roles that specific sort of access behavior, you've done a very good job of really limiting the attack vector and limiting the scope of somebody getting on the network and doing things that they shouldn't. So these are examples. In this example, if it's a guest, they go internet only. Some of the applications we're going to block. We're probably going to throttle some of that traffic. May even put them on a separate VLAN. Maybe reduce their quality of service on some stuff so they don't eat up the valuable airtime from other solutions. A contractor, usually they're kind of a hybrid. They're not a full employee, but they need more access rules than a guest would. They may need to get some network printers, may have a local email file or email accounts while they're there for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or so. And certainly an employee could be treated entirely differently with what they have access to on the network. So these are very real scenarios. And again, Wi-Fi technology we'll get into in a minute. There are mechanisms already in place to make this relatively simple where they can, based on who that user is, they get dynamically assigned an access policy. In many cases, this can be more secure than a wired network. In a wired network, you generally don't have the same sort of differentiation of access and authentication. They're kind of trusting that the physical security of plugging in is a way to vet the user. Not too many people do this kind of role-based access on the wired side network. This is a big advantage you have when you roll out pervasive wireless. You can have these kind of security policies on a per-user basis enforced and applied right there at the edge so that you can differentiate access based on user role. This is the other major thing that's happening that's related. It's differentiation of devices. All these different devices are connecting. I may want to treat these devices differently. Common things are like bring your own device scenarios. Where's my personal mobile device? But I want to treat that differently than my thermostat or my Apple TV in a conference room, or I may have a kiosk tablet that's out there connecting over Wi-Fi. Very different use cases. Again, you want to differentiate that access to the best of your ability so that you can make sure that if someone gets into a IoT device, they're limited in their ability to spread or get into different parts of the network. And it dovetails into this concept. So I mentioned there are mechanisms in place for doing role-based access. The most common way you'll see this is something called 802.1x, and that is radius. It's called strong authentication. You'll hear a bunch of terms be thrown around, but it's based off of a protocol that's existed a long time and actually was originally enforced for port-based security on switches. It became much more practical and much more of a natural workflow in the wireless world because there was no physical connection to a switch. They wanted to apply this kind of traffic and authentication policy. And we don't see people put this in all the time. So this is one of those mistakes we see. They're not taking advantage of the mechanisms that are already in place, and certainly something that you'll want to look at as part of your security strategy. The way it sort of works is you kind of have your client, you've got the access point, you've got a radius server, and LDAP is generally going to be that user store, whether it's Active Directory or Novell eDirectory, something along those lines. But that's where the user role lives. And this whole process of communication that happens when you authenticate to a 802.1x protected wireless network is information gets passed. That's how the user gets authenticated. And one of the very important things that happens that's a function of radius is what they call an attribute. An attribute gets passed that allows any enterprise wireless vendor, including us, to see, okay, they are this role. It's a tunnel private group ID. And it's a list of number, and we can take that number and say, okay, that means that person's in the HR department, or they're a contractor, or they're in finance. Based off of that user role information, then we can say, okay, well, I want to dynamically apply a different security policy. I want to differentiate the access experience like we saw in the conference room. The only prerequisite for that is that they have an LDAP or Active Directory account. Most customers already do a pretty good job of breaking out those user groups and group memberships within Active Directory. You probably already segment things like that. Higher ed does students versus faculty. Again, a lot of corporate solutions will do the HR department and finance department and things like that. And you can take advantage of the work that's already been done to differentiate those user roles in Active Directory by just pointing it here and letting it tell us what attribute gets returned when they authenticate based on what group membership they have, and then we can dynamically apply a security policy for that specific user role. Very powerful. The mechanisms are already there. It does not take long to set up, but it really allows you to differentiate and have needs-based access when people authenticate to the wireless network. Now, there are multiple things that happen when you do this. I'll show you the point of showing you all this in just a minute, but bear with the process. This is the whole process that happens when you authenticate to an 802.1x network. Lots of information is going back and forth. Keys get exchanged. Certificates are involved. So although it's very powerful and it gives you that role-based access view, not every device can support this type of communication. Not every device can support certificates. Not every device has the processing power to do this kind of transaction. Can you think of a device type that cannot do this type of processing power? I mentioned earlier in the day. Starts with an I, ends with a T. It's got an O in the middle. A lot of IoT devices. So when we talked about the cheapest way to get those devices connected onto the network, they're not putting a lot of processing power into those devices. They want to get a cheap Wi-Fi card on there to get it connected to the network. HVAC system, all these headless devices, they will not support this type of authentication. It's too much processing power. They will support primarily probably just a pre-shared key, and that's it. So although this is a very powerful thing, this is something you absolutely should do when you have the devices that can support it. For example, your corporate laptops and Sometimes BYOD gets a little tricky there sometimes too with some additional settings you may have to do when you don't control the device. But certainly if you're issuing the device and you know what those devices are and you can take advantage of group policy, this is the authentication mechanism you want to be deploying for those type of devices. But it does leave a security gap. We just talked about 20 billion devices that are going to be connecting potentially on your network that won't support this. So again, it'll kind of dovetail into this a little bit, but this is something that we see often is having that same password for multiple devices. In the world of wireless security, you have what I just showed, which is full-blown 802.1x advanced security over on this extreme, and then you've got a pre-shared key on this extreme. It's a key that everybody shares. Anyone who has the key can decrypt the transmissions that are going back and forth and see what's going on, and there's not been a lot of stuff that's in between. You're in one extreme or the other. And in a pre-shared key network, there's typically a one-to-one mapping for wireless network to key, SSID, key. So this is how a general pre-shared key network would work. So if you wanted to say, okay, well, I want to get people on the network, but I can't do the radius type authentication or 802.1x, or I don't want to handle certificates, then you get this kind of design where everybody gets the same key. Another challenge, despite the fact they all have the same key and they can decrypt the information, not a ton of security here, is that you can't differentiate the access. There's no way for a system to know who is who because they're all using the same credentials. When you go back to 802.1x, that example, we could tell who is who based off of group membership. It creates a unique key for that, that user session, very secure. When you're left with this as your only other solution, you don't get those security advantages at all. And you're left in this kind of limbo of how do I deploy something to be as secure as possible but get all my devices on the network. So this is something that Aerohive sort of pioneered, but you're going to see this kind of thing that's happening for most of your vendors. But it's something we've always had and got kind of new life breathed into it with this IoT revolution. This is something we call private pre-shared key. So it's a very, very simple but very elegant way to try to bridge that gap between a pre-shared key that everybody has and full-blown radius that requires certificates and complex exchanges. And what it allows you to do essentially is have a single wireless network, one SSID, but be able to issue out individual pre-shared keys for each user or each device or group of users or group of devices so that you don't have to have a bunch of SSIDs out there. You can have one wireless network, one SSID, and issue out those different pre-shared keys to those different devices. Very powerful, not only from an encryption standpoint, because it's a unique key. So again, that information is going to be encrypted for that session. But because the keys are unique, when it hits the Aerohive network, we can tell by the key that they used what type of user they are. You set all that up and issue the keys. And that's what makes this very powerful, because now you can address multiple different access scenarios over wireless. Just using to the device, it's just a pre-shared key. Every device supports a pre-shared key. You don't have to worry about certificates. You don't have to worry about key exchanges. You don't have to worry about any what checkbox do I have to put on a BYOD device to say check the certificate or not. All that pain goes away because every device supports a PSK. To them, they're just going to connect. They're going to do it one time, and they're on the network. They're onboarded. From that visibility slide we talked about the very first part, what that also gives you is accountability. So we can see when somebody connects with their key who that user is. It's a much easier way to determine identification of a user without needing an 802.1x username. So it's very powerful. It allows you to, if nothing else, reduce the number of wireless networks that you need out there. Is it a good thing or a bad thing to have a lot of wireless networks out there in the air? Shit, three of you said it at the same time. I don't think I can throw three at one time. But on the honor code, at the end, you can come up and grab a B because you're correct. You do not want a lot of SSIDs that are out there. Every SSID that you create is a bunch of management overhead that saturates the channel, makes everybody have to wait. You want the minimum amount of SSIDs possible to get all your onboarding scenarios out there. One of the beauty parts of this solution is I can have one SSID and accomplish all of these different use cases that are out there. So most of our customers tend to do something along the lines of an 802.1x SSID like we talked about before, because that